Well, it's good to see this great crowd out here this morning to hear me talk. Well, and some other people later on. So, no, I'll get mine out of the way, and so you can get on to the good stuff. But uh, I guess to start out talking about the history of shortleaf pine on the plateau, I really have to tell you how I got into it. You know, it makes sense after you listen for a little while, I think, because I'm not a forester. My whole career was with Tennessee Wildlife for 35 years. But somewhere before I retired, back in the 90s, I got interested in native grasses, and I noticed a lot of grasses out on the Catoosa Wildlife Management area. And occasionally we would have things happen out there, and I'd see more. And back in the late 90s, we had an event here, the pine beetle outbreak, which occurred 98 and 99, and of course I'm sure most everybody in here remembers that. It was really a bad infestation and resulted in a whole lot of damage to pine across the plateau, not just shortleaf pine, but loblolly pine as well, and even some white pine, and I heard even some hemlock occasionally. But the Catoosa Wildlife Management Area was purchased with Pittman Robertson funds back beginning in the late 40s and finishing in the 50s. And it's 80,000 acres. At that time, it was the largest land holding in the state of Tennessee. And that land, it came about because of interests of sportsmen here in this area. And it was immediately they started managing the best they could at that time. But in the wildlife or forestry profession, you think about things that you would like to do, certain management strategies. You thought, I know what to do if I was just allowed to do it. And of course, you have the public, which may have different questions about your strategy, and they think they know the best. And of course, they have the purse strings and a lot of influence. But sometimes events occur which gives you that opportunity to do some things. And one, for us, on Catoosa, the pine beetle outbreak resulted in a big timber harvest that we never could have done any other way. And of course, it was out of necessity. They wanted to salvage the shortleaf pine and the other pines there that were in the process of being infested with pine beetles. So we went to the Wildlife Commission and told the commission about what was happening with our resource, and that we need to salvage as much as possible so we don't lose the timber. So for the next 2.5 years into 2001, the timber operation took place, and much of it was just pine that was cut. Of course, it was whatever was there. There was some loblolly and there was some Virginia pine, but the most of it was shortleaf pine. Some of those stands were really, really nice. One site there that we call at the roll chopper, because it's on that side of the road if you drive out Otter Creek Road. It's about a 400-acre tract, and in that tract, that was the last site of the red cockaded woodpecker in this part of the state. There was only one other site down in Ocoee. They vanished soon after that, and there was a remnant population in the Daniel Boone up in Kentucky. So we lost that stand of pines there, and some of those that were harvested 70 to 90 years old, and possibly even older than that. Some really big trees, 20 inches in diameter, and some bigger than that. In all, is about 1,555 acres of pine that was harvested. As the salvage operation progressed, we saw the tremendous response from the grasses and forbs on the ground, and then a lot of plant diversity from the grasses, such as big blue stem, little blue stem, split beard, Indian grass, and a lot of different forbs, which were really beneficial to wildlife and the cover. Then we had an idea that we would like to do something and take advantage of that opportunity presented itself. So we started burning some of those sites, and I was getting along kind of late in my career, and I thought, well, if this doesn't fly, I could retire, but I didn't want to right then. So I started researching myself and talking with the guys on the area, and of course they had seen a lot of the native grass, and we started looking at the history of the plateau. And you may not be familiar with the term open range or the fence law. Open range is where the livestock runs free. And if you have a farm crop, you would have to fence your crop against livestock, and that would be horses and cattle, sheep, and hogs on the plateau. And I've talked to people who grew up here and who remember those days. And I know we have such a hog problem now, but even with free-ranging hogs back then, there were no populations established from those hogs that were released. They never became feral because, well, of course, people were hungrier back then, and so that kind of controlled it. But there was sheep as well, and I can't imagine sheep running free now with all the dogs. And I've talked to some of the guys who were in that era, how they did it. Well, they had war on dogs, I can tell you. But that combined with the fire, and a couple of guys I've talked with extensively about how that was made possible. He said, well, we burn the woods every year. He said, if it would burn, if there was a rain, it got too wet. And well, J. Paul Smith, you may know him, heavy equipment business and excavator in 70 North, and he gave me some details about how they burned. They would soak burlap and kerosene and tie a wire around it, hook a rope to that and get on a horse, take off in the woods till it burned out, and then go home. And, prescribed burning, fire breaks. Yeah, he said, well, a fire break would be a creek or a stream somewhere, or a road, or maybe it would rain. So that's the way they did it. The law changed in 1947. The legislature passed a law which went into effect statewide. And prior to that, there were some areas with high population where they had a private act, and would say that if your county is a certain population, like above 50 or 70,000, then you could not run livestock free. But in 1947, they changed the law so that livestock had to be fenced in. Okay, that combined with a new effort about 1950 to suppress all fire, basically shut fires down except for some arson fire. And of course, anytime you change a law like that, it takes a period of time for the law to take effect. There are people say we've always done it this way and we will continue to do it that way. And of course, then there's prosecution can take place, when there's some diehards who don't want to do that. But that changed a lot on the landscape of much of Tennessee, and particularly the plateau. Here in this county, there are two areas that were known as big grassy areas. Those were Grassy Cove. One of the first settlers who saw the area described it as 3,000 acres of grass that would reach to a horse's bridle. And of course, Crab Orchard area, it was basically grassland from the bottom of Spencer Mountain there all the way to Daddy's Creek. And it was up in the hundreds of acres. In Calvin Dixon's book on Tennessee counties, he quotes an early traveler, Francis Bailey, in 1797, described crab orchards as a fine large plain or natural meadow containing many hundred acres and covered throughout its whole extent with a tall, rich grass, surrounded on every side by the neighboring mountains. and that reference was to crabworts. And in Ramsay's Annals of Tennessee, he reported that in 1783 on the Cumberland Plateau, surveyors on a new road passing through the meadowlands, and that was the Avery Trace, reported numerous herds of deer, elk, and buffalo. By discovering the early history of the plateau, we can see there were grasslands and a fire history dating back to its use by the Native Americans. And then you can see those practices were picked up by the first settlers. And granted, some of that was very detrimental to good forestry, but in some species, like those tolerant of fire, like shortleaf pine, oak, then it favored some of those, and some of the species that cannot tolerate fire were eventually weeded out and couldn't compete. Back on the Catoosa Savanna, the one site that we call the Halloween burn, it's about 400 acres. Because of a hot fire in late October, it killed a lot of woody vegetation. That area responded tremendously to native grasses, and that was the site of the RCW. And with that burn, after that is where we begin to see shortleaf pine respond in that site, I guess there before any other site. And when we started out, it was going to be oak savanna, and even on the signage that we put, of course, the constituents for the Wildlife Agency, they favored a mass-bearing tree like oak, hickory, and soft mass. But we had fought that battle some with pines, even when pine was planted. But we saw the shortleaf pine respond naturally in that particular site early on. And that was even without planning for it. We had periodic fires, continued to burn, and the shortleaf continued to grow. And of course, the seed source, we had that massive pine beetle kill, so the only thing you can assume that the seed was in the ground there, and it survived for a period of time until that duff layer was removed, and then the seed came in contact with the soil, germinated, and it popped up there. The Wildlife Agency's forest management in the modern era was launched in 1980. And the first forester in Nashville was Ken Arney, and he launched that, and it's still managed today pretty much the same way it was set out. It was only natural that Catoosa be the first area where modern forest management was started by the agency, although in the past there were some foresters there, and it was not conducted in the same way that it is today. As a matter of fact, Steve Patrick back there is one of those early foresters, launched his career here and sent him on his way after that. So there was some opposition to some of the forestry practices and some of the techniques, and not long after I arrived in Region 3 in the late 70s, we had a big controversy over clear cutting. And it was, we cut about as much as 30 acres at one time. So some people didn't like that, and we fought that battle and continued to do modern forest management. Back to the pine beetle infestation, where we knew we were going to lose timber. The agency made that decision to cut as much as possible. Of course, you know what happened. The pine beetle takes its toll, and the quality of the timber goes down, and the market is next. It goes down really bad. And that's when we agreed to do the savanna, and Gary Myers approved of that, so we started burning, and that's history. It may have been a little controversy early on, but then hunters quickly adapted to that. And by the time that we had started the savanna, then hunters who first didn't like it, then they saw it's real open, you could shoot for a long ways or whatever, and then they found that certain wildlife were attracted to that open habitat. And so we weathered that storm as well. And now, after a few years, it's a subject of a lot of research. University of Tennessee has conducted a lot of research in the savanna, including the plant response to fire and fire frequency, and now even a shortleaf component, looking at the response of shortleaf pine to all the burning, and of course point counts for songbirds. And it's been visited by numerous agencies, and I'm sure a lot of you in this room, professional foresters from across the state and even out of state, have visited the area, some from 3 or 4 states last summer. So in looking at the history of the Cumberland Plateau, we find in the literature that if you go to the library, most every term they use for pine would be yellow pine. Of course, that includes more than just shortleaf, but that's the way it was recorded. And we know the historic range of the shortleaf on the plateau from way down in Alabama on up across the plateau into Kentucky and still further north. And the county just north of us here, this is Cumberland, and the one north is Fentress County. I had occasion to go to the library in Jamestown and try to search. Well, it was, matter of fact, it was Mike Black who got me on this. Requested that I do a talk on the history of the shortleaf pine on the plateau, which I knew nothing about, and so I had to scurry around. I went to the library in Jamestown. Time was running short, and I was reading as fast and looking at all these books and trying to find something, and some ladies there saw me, and they came over and said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "Well, I'm doing research." And they said, "What are you researching?" I said, "Shortleaf pine." And I thought, well, that's the end of that. And then they came back and said, "We'll help you." and tell us what to look for. I said, well, they said, "You need to look in census books." And I thought, that's the last thing I think I need to look at. But so they started looking, and they brought a book over and said, "Here's what you look for." Well, they pointed out some things that had happened in Fentress County down through the years, and one was tar and turpentine. And I was amazed at what I found. It was the first industry in Fentress County was making tar and turpentine. So in the census book, they'd have the occupation listed for, say, John Smith, and they'd say where he lives. And most of the time it would have like, lives on Mill Creek, and he's a tar burner. And they'd have another name, and he's a stiller. And we knew they were distilling turpentine, because if it was corn, they wouldn't list that. So, but there was a lot of that, and some did both, and they'd have so-and-so was listed, he has a pine orchard. And I couldn't figure out for sure what that was, what a pine orchard is, and I had an idea, but I was up UT one day, and Larry Tankersley, I asked him, and he said, "Well, I'll tell you what it is." Of course, he's from Georgia. And a pine orchard is where the trees are just set aside, where they tap the trees for the rosin, where they're going to make turpentine. Now, and then I talked with Jerry Gurnt up in Fentress County, one of the Gurnt family, and he knew, he didn't do it himself, but it has been passed down in his family. And what he described was how they do it was you would tap the tree so long, and at some point you decide that you're going to make tar instead of turpentine. Then they could saw the tree off above that for lumber, where you had tapped the tree, and then you dig up the stump if you can, and they pile up the stumps in a circle, and you dig a circle around the pile, and you taper the circle so that it runs out on one side lower than the other, and they cover the pine stumps in dirt, set it on fire, and then so what you're doing, you're cooking out the tar. and then they dip the tar up, put it in a barrel or cask made of, most of the time, oak. And so that's how they manufactured the tar at that time. And of course, the turpentine had to be collected and distilled, much like any distilling process. But by looking at those census records, you can gain a lot of information about what was done there. And it was active for about 75 years up until about 1910. And there was a little after that, but not a great deal. From Albert Hogue's book, I'll just give you a few of these records. It says that John Young manufactured spirits of turpentine at a spring under a rock on the mountain between Crooked Creek and Mill Creek in 1827. Another record shows that Wesley Owens has a steel camp and a pine orchard on the mountain in 1830. And you can go on throughout all the census records like that. In Hogue's book, he gives a description of a tar kiln in Fentress County, and it was over 60 feet in diameter and 5 to 6 feet high and capable of yielding 2,000 gallons of tar. And the community of Boatland, which is western side of Fentress County, it was named because they built the flatboats, and they were tied up there to a deep hole on the east fork of the Obi River, O-B-E-Y. The boats from Boatland carried tar and turpentine. Of course, they also floated lumber down as well, down the Obi and Cumberland to Nashville and Louisville. And up in the community of Allard, yellow pine is listed as the most abundant for commercial value in the community's history. And in 1930, Fentress County yielded more forest products than any Tennessee county. And much of that, of course, was from pine. In Allard, this is another interesting record of tar being sold. In 1871, an entry was made at a store loaded up with 825 pounds of venison and 12 kegs of tar. The venison was sold in Frankfort, Kentucky. I guess Kentuckians had already killed all their deer by that time. That was on January 27th and has the price listed, just as much as like 15 cents a pound. The same records described Allard was surrounded by typical plateau country with miles of wild grasses offering fine grazing for livestock of all kinds. And I wonder if that area could have been a pine savanna. Well, I think it was, because I talked to Jerry Gurnt. He told me that when he was a child, he had ridden through the woods in a T-model Ford. And in the same area, he hunted in the fall. And he said there would be shocks of hay in the woods. And the Tennessee Ornithological Society went there in the late 50s to look for red cockaded woodpeckers. So I think that's what it was. Another intriguing thing that I found was in Mark Twain's autobiography, he left this statement: "There is no end to the tar, pitch, and turpentine which these vast pineries will yield in the pineries and knobs of the Cumberland Mountains of Fentress County." Now, how did he know that? I don't know. He was born in Missouri, but according to records in Fentress County, he was conceived in Fentress County. So I guess he just absorbed that before he left. But his father did own 70,000 acres there at one time in Fentress County. Of course, I went over the description. Most of the tar kilns were about 20 to 30 feet in diameter. I read of one settler who he was traveling west, and he ran into bad weather. He was going on a road which was about where Highway 62 is, and where you have the intersection of 62 and 127, which is now Clark Range. And in that area, bad weather overtook his family, and so he stopped. He built a log cabin, and they said he made tar all winter. So when the spring broke, he sold his tar and moved on west. That area also of Fentress County, at some time early 1900s, a man named Cyrus Clark, he had been in the rugby community, and he saw that area, so he brought purebred cattle from the north and released them on the range there. And he said because of the luxuriant grasses that grew there, the same area where they're making tar and turpentine. The 1910 census, I looked for Cumberland County, and there was all kinds of occupations listed for working in timber. Those tie maker, lumber, sawmill, teamster, mule driver, logger, bark peeler, tan bark, and tanner, was those related to the chestnut industry. I couldn't find any accounts of tar and turpentine being made in Cumberland, but just west a little, White County, and then also down the plateau and into North Alabama. There was a lot of records there. And when did the big timbering start for shortleaf pine? Well, according to Dr. Clatterbuck, this started in the early 1900s after railroads were built, and primarily that north-south route from Cincinnati to Chattanooga. And I found one record where, and a photo where it showed timber or lumber being hauled from Allard to Elgin, so that was the main railroad route, and it even described what a wagon load of long yellow pine boards, a 2-mule team wagon would haul about 1,000 board feet. And it said that they would see as many as 200 wagon loads a day on that route. So they were really cutting timber. And why'd they cut it? Well, of course, you know, the shortleaf, no limbs for a long way, and much easier to handle and cut into timber. I know that another account in the 30s, the Gurnt operation, of course, you know that family at one time owned about 300,000 acres, and they were big into timber. And it said that they could have as much as 10 million board feet of dry, long stock yellow pine lumber available at any time during the 30s. So it was very important to that county at that time. More evidence about the pine on the plateau are just place names. And one, I saw this several years ago and I had no idea, and then when I read about it, it did make sense. There's a road up in Pickett County called Tar Kiln Road, and so now we know why. And there's a Tar Kiln Mountain and a Tar Kiln Creek, and a lot of other names with pine in them, like Pine Knob up in Kentucky, Pine Knot, Pine Haven, Piney Creek, Piney Falls, Piney Grove, Pine Orchard, Pine Springs, and any number like that. Even in Fentress County, Buffalo Cove, Barron Springs, and Clark's Range. Now Clark, he was the guy who started the cattle. His name was Clark, and so the post office shortened it from 2 words to 1 and made it Clark Range. So that's where that name came from. Other records from the early travelers in the 1700s, Fritz botanist Andre Machu, he traveled across the plateau, the Avery Trace, and he described the grassy openings and evidence of fire and megafauna, including elk and bison. And he also observed dead pine trees, and he said he researched that and found people who told him that it might occur every 25 years or so. I wonder what that was. It might have been pine beetles, you think? So the plateau has changed a lot since those days. We had increase in population. Of course, the railroads made the timbering and easier and to market because the timber was here, but there was no way to get it out. But after the railroad came, and then small farms, people began to move to the city, and then Bowater moved in with and purchased around 300,000 acres. Of course, they planted loblolly, which would be more favorable for producing pulp. So we did lose a lot of our shortleaf pine. And then when the beetle kill occurred in 98 and 99, it really took its toll. So the plateau has changed. We do know a lot about what it was in the past. So if we want to look back at that record and point to some of it in the future, then I think we have a record so that we can do that. So that's about it.